From the 1940s through the Cold War, 1/3 of the CIA's entire budget was devoted to media manipulation. They do not want you thinking for yourself. Today, the same tactics have gone digital and are far more ubiquitous. Former State Department official Mike Benz joins me to expose what he calls the censorship industrial complex, a coordinated web of government agencies, NGOs, and hedge funds working together to shape narratives, silence dissent, and weaponize culture itself. And it's not for your benefit, it's for theirs. This interview is one of those rare occasions where someone fundamentally alters my mental map of how the world actually works. So strap in, because even if you already know Mike Benz, this one is going to make your hair stand on end. Without further ado, I bring you Mike Benz. I have always considered NGOs to be pro-humanity philanthropies, but in researching you, you make them sound more like an extension of the CIA and a way for global elites to control the power structures of the world, essentially for maximum personal gain. Can you explain to me what NGOs are and how they came to be in the way that we know them now?
NGOs are essentially the kind of stem cell of the influence world. They can take any number of forms. They can play a wide role in organic and grassroots movements, in the playthings of billionaires as fronts for intelligence and statecraft operations. But they really came into the fore of statecraft and intelligence work with changes to the tax code in the early 20th century, and then the role that they played, particularly in World War II, when relief agencies came to play this kind of outsized role in supplies and the supplies and logistics for the war through religious charities, through humanitarian and philanthropic relief. These organizations, which were philanthropic in name, began to be used as a way to move behind the Iron Curtain during the Cold War, to work in South and Central America as a way to have logistics, supply lines, run money, run guns, run supplies all over the world. And because it is deniable under the banner of aid, and because attacking NGOs looks like a crackdown on civil society, it's a little bit like, there was a strange moment in the Israel-Iran conflict several months ago where Iran or Hamas would have military facilities under a hospital. And then when Israel got attacked, it turned out a bunch of their military apparatus and structures were also under hospitals. And so you don't want to attack a hospital because that will draw a kind of humanitarian outcry to the world. And so you end up having the things that sound best in names end up being the most effective fronts for the dirtiest deeds.
Now, the big thing that I really want to understand, so by nature, I'm not a conspiratorial guy, but modern life is pushing me more and more in that direction. There's an author named James Burnham who's had a huge impact on the way that I think, and his thesis is there's always been elites. There will always be elites. No matter what, there's going to be a small group of people that basically control the way other people think. All throughout human history, they've been able to control the narrative because they can control the dissemination of media. Now, though, in the age of social media, we're being asked a question, which is what's going to happen when you lose control of the ability to control the narrative? So the worldview that I'm updating as I research you is that the manipulation of the media landscape is even more coordinated and global than I ever would have imagined. And I want to figure out if that's me sort of letting my imagination run wild, or if really we are, as a populace, being intentionally controlled at the level of narrative.
Well, it's always been this way since the printing press because of just the cost that it took to run a media business. It couldn't be done in an amateur way because everyone didn't have their own platform for free like you have on X or Facebook or YouTube or Instagram or Twitch or even a blog. And so there was a kind of elite control over media because there were so few messengers, and so being able to consolidate control over just a few messengers allows you to control all of the messages. And this was a big part of the American influence apparatus around the world, even before World War II. I mean, if you look at things like the Spanish-American War and Remember the Maine, and this is how we got an American empire in 1898. It was yellow journalism. It was just a handful of newspapers. The William Randolph Hearst set, was able to effectively control all of American opinion in order to mislead the American population essentially into the idea that Spain had, bombed the Maine in the Havana harbor, and that this was a military attack that necessitated the conquest of Cuba and ended up netting us the Philippines. And that persisted all the way up through Vietnam with the Gulf of Tonkin. Again, you only had 3 news channels on TV at that time. You had CBS, NBC, and ABC, which all grew out of veterans from the Office of War Information. The Pentagon in 1941-42 centralized media effectively in the United States as part of the World War II effort. So all of the radio stations, all of the major print distribution newspapers, journals, periodicals, Hollywood, they all ran through the Pentagon as part of centralizing propaganda and ensuring support for the war, as well as working with international partners in Europe and around the world. That relationship maintained itself during the Cold War. It greatly expanded, actually, as the State Department and the what's now the U.S. Agency for Global Media, but at the time it was CI proprietary media organizations like Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Voice of America, Radio Free Asia. You had things like, Project Mockingbird, where you had the CI explicitly placing stringers and editors on almost all of the major distribution newspapers, not just in the United States, but all over the world. You had the State Department's focus on public diplomacy and funding so-called independent media outlets all over the world. So even if they weren't CI proprietaries, they would be effectively on U.S. government payroll. That exploded after the 1960s with USAID being formed, and this idea that providing funding for media outlets is part of the humanitarian work of ensuring free speech around the world. That would come to be quite ironic when USAID would champion internet censorship after too much free speech ended up losing elections. But it's a huge part of it. I mean, a third of the CI's budget in the 20th century went to media, and then it's a huge amount. The world is moving from this kind of military occupation imperial model to a soft power influence model where everything moves through democracy. That is the vote of the people. At least this is how they used to define it before 2016, but the vote of the people to give legitimacy to the government so that the government has the consent of the governed. And in that world, the desire for empire has not gone down at all. The demand for political vassalage control is still there, but now you can't use guns and napalm and tanks and tens of thousands of casualties in every country in order to enforce that. So how do you do it? Well, now the new battlefield becomes hearts and minds and influencing the electorate in every country to make sure that they vote the way the U.S. State Department wants them to vote. And so that is why you have this coterie of government agencies around the State Department, from the CIA to USAID to the U.S. Agency for Global Media, to even things like the World Bank, the IMF, the Export-Import Bank, the Development Finance Corporation, who all put their levers on the various media institutions. For example, oftentimes there will be a condition of a World Bank or IMF loan that you must allow free and independent media, which they define almost exclusively as meaning pro-State Department media. At the time, this was attached to this concept of free speech diplomacy and a way of showing that the free world, the capitalist, inspired, economically skyrocketing United States and Western allies were a better system of government than a closed system, a closed society under the Iron Curtain or under the Soviet communist boot heel. And so there was a real convergence between our interests and our values. And so a lot of this statecraft, this funding of media and support for media pluralism and media freedom was tied to our interests, in that the more media we could pipe into Romania or Hungary or Poland or anywhere in Central and Eastern Europe or in places in Africa or Asia or Central America that were tilting Soviet, the more funding, the more control we would have over the hearts and minds, the more control we would have over their elections, over their elected leaders, over their domestic referendum in terms of whether to allow a U.S. military base or to go forward with a trade agreement or allow an American oil company or mining company to operate profitably in the region. And so everything is downstream of that. All the little operations like influencing union groups or universities or members of the military in a country is all downstream of having this base of favorability in terms of hearts and minds.
If that works and you can influence a country enough, ours or anybody else's, through media, like if you've got Andrew Tate and it's like, oh, he's actually going to sway people, like we've got to shut it down. You get why people are like that. Charlie Kirk was just assassinated, again, for things that he's saying. But it's like, if these things work, then you can begin to map why the immune system response to Andrew Tate was so extreme. You can understand why somebody felt like, okay, I don't like what Charlie's saying, so he absolutely has to be taken out. In some ways, it's almost more distressing that we're that easily influenceable. But okay, so that's piece number one. Piece number two is that at some point in the story, this stops being about foreign policy is good for let's just take an American context. American foreign policy stops being good for Americans, and it starts being good for the people who have an economic interest. And so you have made what I would say is a compelling case for, you can think of something like George Soros's Open Society as being a hedge fund that has an NGO attached to it in order to make sure that they get the policies that they need. One, have I understood that correctly? And if I have, talk to me about what it means to draft off of policy.
I'm so glad that you picked that up. That is such a central point. So few people appreciate kind of the magnitude and implication of that. And it's such an under-discussed part of this. The Soros story it's a very clean example of what you just identified, which is that you have the Soros Management Fund, which is kind of the flagship hedge fund, private equity, alternative asset investments. These are all the different liquid and illiquid investments that the Soros empire makes in currencies around the world, in companies around the world, in industries around the world. And then you've got two different things that the hedge fund rides on. One of them is the relationship with the U.S. government, and the other is the civil society institutions. And in each case, the way the racket works is that Soros will fund government agencies to push things that maximize what's best for the hedge fund, and will deploy this philanthropic front through the Open Society Foundation to push things that so the government does the top-down influencing, and then the civil society organizations do the bottom-up influencing, and it all drives profits towards Soros Inc., which then also gives more money to influence politicians and more money to feed into the Open Society network, so that the racket just keeps growing and growing. And Soros is by no means the only one who does this. I mean, there are dozens, hundreds of hedge fund folks who operate this way now. The second thing that you asked was about how you can draft off policy. And this is when I refer to the blob, which is a term coined by Barack Obama's Deputy National Security Advisor, Ben Rhodes, when he was trying to describe the foreign policy establishment in Washington that's more powerful than the presidency. This is the Obama White House saying there's some force here that's bigger than us that we can't take on. So this is a very bipartisan thing, and deliberately so. But I talk about these kind of three layers to the blob. You've got the inside guts of it, which is the State Department, the CIA, USAID, the Department of War, the Export-Import Bank, the Development Finance Corporation, all of these foreign-facing influence operations that are designed to be, best for American interests as they describe it. Then you've got underneath that the civil society layer, which is all these interstitial partnerships between the government and the boots on the ground, the universities, the media organizations, the unions, the universities, the members of the legal profession, the members of the public health profession, all their different trade associations, which will get USAID funding and will work with the U.S. Embassy in the region. But on top of that, you have this donor drafter class. And I use that term because you can think of it like a bike race. In a bike race, you don't want to be first because the person who's in first cuts the wind for everybody else behind them. So it's more metabolically, energetically expensive to be number one in the bike race until the end of the race because everybody else gets to draft off the wind that you've cut for them. It's the same thing for businesses, for hedge funds, for multinational corporations who serve as, oftentimes portfolio companies for these big private equity interests. You don't want to, let's just say you're an oil company and there's a huge amount of oil in Venezuela, but it's controlled by a communist dictatorship. Now, what used to be done in the 19th century is, you had a lot of these companies try to effectively wage their own wars. Like United Fruit, for example, would go into Guatemala and Nicaragua, and they would go in with a mercenary army. They would literally pay, hundreds of people from Miami and Tampa and New Orleans to, get on ships essentially, and they would back a military coup themselves, and then they would work with the State Department and the War Department for some top-up protection and diplomatic support. But what ended up happening is this relationship between big business in the United States and multinational corporations that get their supplies from overseas, that have their markets overseas, that have their labor overseas. It became more and more important for the War Department, the State Department, the intelligence services to the more they did for those corporations, the more they cut the wind for it, the more profits those corporations would have because they wouldn't have to do it themselves. And in many cases, most cases, they can't do it themselves. When you look at, for example, ExxonMobil and how much it's profited off of partnerships in the Middle East or oil coming out of the Caspian, the Caspian Basin, or you look at what happened, for example, in the 2014 to 2022 Ukraine situation. The profits of Exxon and Chevron and Shell and British Petroleum completely exploded particularly after 2022, but really after the 2014 coup, as the State Department led a sanctions campaign against Russia after 2014. That was the Maidan Revolution. That was the CIA, USAID-backed coup to overthrow the democratically elected government in Ukraine. Viktor Yanukovych was ran out of office as the CIA effectively ran a January 6th operation. If you accept the official story on January 6th, that was literally what was done by our CIA and State Department. Victoria Nuland, 2 months before that coup, described how the U.S. government, through the State Department, USAID, and other government agencies, had given over $5 billion of U.S. taxpayer money to the very right sector groups who ended up setting the entire Maidan Square on fire and violently ousting the democratically elected president out of office. When she gave those remarks at a U.S. State Department event, she was standing behind one poster for Chevron and another for ExxonMobil. And as when Crimea broke away and the Donbass broke away, the U.S. State Department, through Ambassador Daniel Fried, led an international sanctions roadshow to cut Russian gas off of all of Europe, country by country, just cutting off the market for Exxon and Chevron's competitors. So now they can't get cheap natural gas from Russia. They have to buy much more expensive liquefied natural gas from Houston, Texas, paying huge markups. But now it's a captured market because it's enforced by the barrel of a gun from the U.S. War Department, which was literally, taking the territory in eastern Ukraine, and by the U.S. State Department, which was diplomatically pressuring every country in Europe to only buy from these multinational corporations who would get there. But it's that way with everything. Every business works this way. Every industry works this way. It's the same thing with mining, for example. George Soros is a great example in Mongolia in the mid 2000s. The largest copper mine in the world was discovered in Mongolia. And in the early 2000s, there was a fight over which mining companies would get the rights to this mine. And so the U.S. State Department, the U.S. Embassy in Mongolia, worked with the George Soros Open Society Foundation. This is all in WikiLeaks, by the way. You can just go to the WikiLeaks cables and just run a search for Soros or Soros Mongolia, and you can see this right out in the open. But the U.S. State Department effectively worked on with the Open Society Institute in order to make sure that Rio Tinto got the deal essentially, and got it on favorable terms. The Open Society Institute led riots and protests against the Mongolian government to coerce more profitable deal terms for Rio Tinto, while George Soros has a huge, long position in Rio Tinto. So you've got street protest movements all over Mongolia. You've got huge amounts of money pouring in from the Open Society Institute and from USAID grants and U.S. State Department grants to astroturf this movement. And it's all redounding to the secular insular profits of the largest donor to the Democrat Party. I mean, Soros gave $100 million to the Democrats the last election cycle. The second largest donor was $40 million.
We'll get back to the show in a moment, but first, let's talk about one of my non-negotiable rules. Eliminate unnecessary complexity. Complexity slows you down, creates mistakes, and drains your mental energy. Yet, most business owners are mentally juggling separate systems for banking, expenses, invoices, and taxes. Found eliminates that complexity completely. It's the one business banking platform that consolidates everything: expense tracking, invoice management, tax preparation, even virtual cards for different spending goals. Small business owners are seeing real results. One Found user said, "Found is going to save me so much headache. It makes everything so much easier. Expenses, income, profits, taxes, invoices even. Found has 30,000 five-star reviews just like that. Open a Found account for free at found.com/impact. Found is a financial technology company, not a bank. Banking services are provided by Piermont Bank, member FDIC. And now let's get back to the show. Is it true that there's documentation on, like literal documentation on how to launch a street uprising?
Oh my God, where do you want me to start? There's an entire field. It's not just like a document. I mean, this is democratization studies, international relations 101 now. College kids learn how to do this. This is how think about someone like Michael McFaul, who was the U.S. ambassador to Russia. He spent 30 years at Stanford working on the body of work, the playbook on how to do it, the the sequencing of events, all the different levers within a society you need to control in order to have it successfully play out. These models are constantly updated for emerging technologies like social media, for emerging laws and counter attempts by government to resist a color revolution, like NGO transparency laws and the like. It's a huge field, and it started off in the 1950s, right in tandem with the construction of the intelligence apparatus in our country. I mean, really, it all goes back to they all call themselves scholars and academics in order to try to, I always say you can't spell academia without CIA, but the fact is Gene Sharp
this is so dark.
Well, to this day, I mean, Gene Sharp started this work in the 1950s, at a time when the U.S. foreign policy establishment was, in the absolute armpit of the Cold War, and trying to figure out how do we, now that the nature of war has moved into the political realm rather than the kinetic military realm, how do we develop a body of theory to reliably be able to go country by country and develop this political influence apparatus? In order, if we lose an election, what do we do in that event? How do we still have a kind of civil society resistance? How can that take power even if we don't win an election? And so this body of work that is now every major university, and I'm not joking when I say that, whether it's Harvard, Stanford, MIT, Dartmouth, Berkeley, Arizona State University, Florida, it is a 101 for getting into this field that you learn about civil resistance. And it is a big part of what the State Department, what USAID, what the U.S. Agency for Global Media does. But Gene Sharp, I mean, this started as I hesitate to even legitimize it with even the front term of academia, because you have to understand that this is a military, and if you want to extend it, a military statecraft and intelligence world completely. Gene Sharp got $50 million from the Department of War to do the research for this at the Harvard Center for International Affairs. Now, for folks who are following along, I'll just let you play out the acronym for Center for International Affairs in your head. This is like right in your face. I mean, this is the Harvard CIA, which was created by Henry Kissinger, who was the national security advisor and Secretary of State, recruited Gene Sharp. They got $50 million from the Department of War, and not just from the Department of War, but from the Psychological Operations Center of it, in order to build the body of work for how groups that were supported by the U.S. State Department could leverage influence of a minority of the population to do bottom-up rather than top-down revolutions. Because prior to World War II, the way you did coups was primarily through the military. What you would do is the State Department, this is before we had a CIA, but the British would do this. The UK Foreign Office would work with, military generals, or the U.S. War Department would work with military generals, police, security forces. And because the guys with guns had a monopoly on violence, the way to do coups was always top down. You would work with the generals, the police, and then you would simply have a military takeover of the country, and then you would have an interim head of state, and then you would try to kind of roll out democracy in a managed way in these vassal state countries. But as it became apparent that you could actually not just have top-down revolutions, but you could have bottom-up revolutions, it turns out there's something that's effectively the same as a military if you get it big enough, and that's a paramilitary. As the U.S. military paradigm moved into what they called small wars, rather than big World War II style things, the CIA, the State Department, USAID, they were all working with hillside guerrilla groups in Cambodia and Laos and Vietnam, or Chile or Colombia, and what they found is actually, if you get a big enough crowd, it's basically like a military. If the mob is so big that the police can't take it on, or if the police end up shooting someone in the crowd, the mob will just kill the police. They're bigger. They outnumber them in many respects. In many cases, they're armed, or they've got kind of small arms, or they've got bulldozers or Molotov cocktails, or and a certain quotient of the police or military on their side as well. Then you can do a bottom-up, so-called people-powered revolution. And the magic behind that was essentially winning enough hearts and minds through the media to accuse the democratically elected leader of being illegitimate or corrupt, mixed with cash, essentially these groups being funded to do it through USAID or the State Department, or flow through entities like the National Endowment for Democracy or the U.S. Institute of Peace. But it's an enormous body of work. It's democratization studies, it's civil resistance. It goes by any number of names, but you can get a comfortable job at a U.S. university, any U.S. university, or even law school, teaching that field to young aspiring coup plotters.
Now, have we ever run the coup playbook against ourselves?
Absolutely. There was a group specifically dedicated to do it by a professor in the field who was also number 3 at the Pentagon. It's called the Transition Integrity Project in 2020. Transition is one of these watchwords. Transition means we're going to overthrow your government. Transition, we call it a democratic transition. That is when we don't like the government that's in power, and so we are going to transition it to a new government. And in 2020, a group was set up called the Transition Integrity Project. It was run by Rosa Brooks, who was a very, very high-ranking Pentagon official for the Obama administration. Not to put too fine a point on it, but she wrote a book in 2016 called How Everything Became War and the Military Became Everything.
Whoa.
And basically on her experiences on how the military can take over the civil society space, and all the different examples of how, the military would fund operas in Eastern Europe to influence hearts and minds. And this is, everything, whether it's media, operas, art murals, graffiti, dance festivals. And you see this now. I mean, there's a big scuffle at South by Southwest, I think in 2023 or 2020. Yeah, I think it was 2023. The Pentagon became one of the biggest funders of music festivals like South by Southwest. You
Were they doing that to control like what bands, or I don't understand?
Well, essentially, now this has been going on for a very, very long time. Music is, and not to detour too hard into this, but the arts and cultural space is a big part of hearts and minds and culture control. And politics is downstream of culture. This is how you see.
Yes, but are they literally like becoming A&R executives? Like, how does this, because one thing I want to understand is, okay, this has been used against us then as recently as 2020. This is very recent. So what do they actually do? Like, how much of this is AstroTurf? I hear so many conspiracy theories, and most of it sound like total BS to me. But what was the actual playbook run on us?
Well, so we sort of 2 open threads right now. One of them is this 2020 Transition Integrity Project. And I want to get deeper into that to immediately answer kind of like how the playbook works in something like the music industry. I can give you some great specific examples, and I can talk about the general structure of it. I'll give you some specific ones. So every year, we as taxpayers give about $350 million to a group called the National Endowment for Democracy. That funding is from us as taxpayers to the Treasury, to the State Department, to NED, the National Endowment for Democracy. The National Endowment for Democracy was created in 1983 by the Reagan administration as a response to the Democrats in the late 1970s severing many of the powers of the Central Intelligence Agency. When the Church Committee and Pike Committee hearings of 75 and 76 ended up revealing the CIA was manipulating domestic politics in order to stop the left-wing anti-Vietnam War movement, Democrats reacted very heavily against the CIA. They hated the CIA in the late 70s, early 80s. Jimmy Carter rode to power on the back of that scandal. One of the first things he did is he put CIA Director Stansfield Turner in charge of the CIA and immediately fired 30% of the entire operations division of the CIA in a single day. It was called the Halloween Massacre. Then in 1979, the U.S. lost control over Iran with the Iranian Revolution. The national security state blamed that on having a weak CIA who could have stopped that coup from happening in Iran. Ronald Reagan wins the presidency, wants to give the CIA their old powers back, but has a problem, which is that the Democrats controlled Congress at the time. They controlled the House of Representatives. And so through the executive branch, he establishes the National Endowment for Democracy, in the words of its founder, Carl Gershman, who he told, I believe it was the Washington Post in 1986, Democrat groups around the world used to get in trouble when they were seen as being subsidized by the CIA. We have not had the power to do that in a long time. That is why the endowment was created. So literally, you have a direct quote from the founder of the group that they were set up to fund the groups, that it would be too embarrassing to the group or too scandalizing to a group if the money came from the CIA. The idea for the National Endowment for Democracy came from the CIA. It came from William Casey and one of his right-hand man guys, Raymond Green, who had worked in the Propaganda and Disinformation Bureau of the CIA for 30 years, who went on to directly draft the legislation establishing the National Endowment for Democracy. The CIA gets a copy of every single grant the National Endowment for Democracy makes. We don't get any transparency over that. So even though it's an NGO that's supposed to be working overtly on philanthropic work, it's a complete intelligence operation. The Biden State Department actually signed this stealth agreement with NED that every single one of their grants is under a total blanket sensitivity. So it's even more secret than the CIA in the sense that even Tulsi Gabbard can't just demand access to it because technically it's not classified. So it can't just be immediately unclassified. It's got this sensitivity blanket that if any of the oversight organs know, then everyone involved in these programs could die because it would put them at such risk to know they're being sponsored by this group that's effectively more secret than the CIA itself. In fact, the Washington Post in the 1990s, when CIA Director Bob Gates was up for confirmation, the Washington Post wrote an article saying we don't even need to confirm a CIA director this year because we have the National Endowment for Democracy, and it's everything the CIA wants to be and more. Well, they have 4 cores at NED, the way it's structured operationally. They have a Republican branch called the IRI. Basically, everyone who wants to run for president has to go through the IRI. John McCain ran IRI for 25 years. Mitt Romney has been on the board of IRI for 15 years. Marco Rubio won the 2024 Man of the Year for IRI. Trump was the only Republican in the past 25 years who was not on the board or running IRI. And this just goes to show how closely the CIA has effectively vetted presidents. There's a Democrat branch called the NDI. Hunter Biden was on the chairman's the chairman's advisory board of NDI. Make of that what you will. But the chairman of the NDI was Madeleine Albright, who was the Secretary of State. So again, you have this State Department CIA nexus. But the other 2 cores are the Center for International Private Enterprise for the CIA and Chamber of Commerce, and the Solidarity Center for the CIA and unions. They also have a media arm to control media. NED does. It's called the Center for International Media Assistance. This is yet another one of these CIA control over media vectors. But just to come back to this music thing, we overthrew the government of Bangladesh in 2024. The Biden administration did. There had been a big beef between the Democrats and the Prime Minister of Bangladesh over a number of issues: military base in the region, petroleum, Hillary Clinton, at one point when she was Secretary of State, threatened to have the IRS go after the prime minister's son who was living in the U.S. But the Biden State Department was losing hearts and minds in Bangladesh. They lost the last two elections, and the State Department had correspondence with the National Endowment for Democracy about what to do about it. After the loss, I believe it was in 2021, 2022, the elections there, the State Department worked with one of their NGO CIA cutouts, the National Endowment for Democracy, about what could be done in Bangladesh, because despite running all this money into the opposition, they still got crushed in the election. And what was proposed was a destabilization campaign instead of trying to win the vote, trying to organize a color revolution to get people in the streets and to destabilize the country in order to essentially break it and induce a crisis. And one of the ways they did that was through funding not just students in universities and all of the different cleavages in Bangladesh society who felt disaffected. For example, NED, with State Department money, sponsored transgender dance festivals, really went after like the LGBT population, went after
as
women
a way
who felt,
to spark division.
Yes, as a way to do street protests and to create an international human rights outcry, as a way to break down society, and so that they wouldn't just have an ordinary vote. It would be chaos. It'd be destabilized. And this is what happens if you can't win an election under stable conditions, induce a crisis, things break, and then there's movement. And then sometimes you can just overthrow the government, like was done in Ukraine and like what was done in Bangladesh. The prime minister had to evacuate the country because, once again, the CIA-backed mobs surrounded the parliament building and then just took power. But within those documents that were produced by the investigative outlet, the Gray Zone, who had a whistleblower at IRI, the NED Republican branch, it was amazing what turned up. The CIA, through IRI, was funding Bangladesh rap and hip hop groups to sponsor musical and hip hop anthems targeted at young people, unemployed people, disaffected youth, to take to the streets and to sow distrust in the Bangladesh government. In fact, this was in the baseline assessment report of IRI to the State Department. They bragged about this. They had columns for all the different grants and what they were doing. And you can actually go on YouTube and if you run a search on my X account for Bangladesh, you'll see all the documents that the Gray Zone published and that I've highlighted. But the CIA through IRI was reporting to the State Department about the different musical anthems that were being produced with State Department money to get people to take to the streets, to get people to distrust or believe that their government was corrupt. And they were reporting on this, how the lyrics were, quote, designed to get people in the streets and protesting. I believe one of the rappers in this group was also a visiting professor at a USAID-sponsored university. That was one of the launching points for these student protests. But you see the same thing everywhere. This happened in Cuba with something called the San Isidro movement, where USAID sponsored one of the main rap and hip hop groups and had this anthem about blood and wasn't blood and soil. It was like land. It was something that it was a Patria y Vida, I think was the name of it. And then got this, this local rap group played on international radio. And while they were working with the Assistant Secretary for Western Hemisphere, and while they were funded by USAID, but you see this, the Biden State Department set up an entire bureau called the State Department Bureau for Music Diplomacy. Last year, they brought 22 different hip hop and rap musicians from 14 different countries to the State Department for training, for activist training. You have revolution music sponsored by the U.S. State Department, USAID. I think freedombeat.org, I think, is one you can look at, where it's literally just civil resistance movement sponsored by the State Department to sponsor riots and revolutions. And this is a checklist item in the same way that music is. And you'll see this in Miami, where I am. The largest performing arts center is the Adrian Arsh Center. Adrian Arsh is one of the largest financial sponsors of the Atlantic Council, which has 7 CIA directors on its board and gets annual funding every year from the War Department, the State Department, USAID, and the National Endowment for Democracy. Then you get this cultural entombment, by the way. This is a big part of when we overthrew the government of Ukraine in 2014. One of the first things we did with the new vassal government, when Yatsenyuk was installed, not by a vote, installed by Victoria Nuland, and she bragged about this on a hot mic that was caught when she said, F the EU, we're going with Yatsenyuk. Vladimir Klitschko is going to have to sit this one out. We'll make him mayor of Kiev, and he'll have to be satisfied with that. One of the first things that happened was they moved the Ministry of Education, the control for it, out of Ukraine and into this EU credentialing body. And one of the red lines that the State Department, USAID, and NATO set for Zelensky his first month in office, the May 2019 Red Lines memo, was that none of the reforms put in place between 2014 and 2019 about education and culture could be reversed. They banned the Russian language, for example, on any Ukrainian TV. They banned Russian access, Russian-controlled social media accounts and Telegram accounts. They banned the Russian language or any Russian affinity teachings in Ukrainian education. You also see, for example, Randy Weingarten, the head of the American Federation of Teachers, making half a dozen pilgrimages over to Ukraine to work with the teachers unions in Ukraine and effectively create this, so that the kids don't get to have any sort of cultural affinity with the political influence within Ukraine, even though half of the country was Russian ethnic. We're not allowed to speak the language. We're not allowed to have any, cultural glorification of anything Russian, so that their minds were controlled in a way that they would grow up to believe in Ukrainian nationalism and the entire purging of any kind of Russian affinity or any kind of alliance between Russia and Ukraine, which had existed, going back to the Crimean War in the 1800s. I mean, going back forever, but completely purged because the CIA ran a coup in 2014 and they didn't want mean reversion after the Crimea referendum in 2014. But you see this everywhere. And it's full spectrum. It's the media, it's the teachers. In fact, the CIA was busted funding our own teachers unions in the US through something called the Vernon Fund, which the CIA would later confess was a CIA front philanthropy that gave $1 million to the National Education Association. That's the largest teachers union in the country, as well as a CIA proprietary called the World Confederation for Organizations of the Teaching Profession.
Hold on. When was this?
This is the 1960s, 1966
Jesus,
to 68.
man. Okay, so let me put a bow on this and see if I'm tracking this accurately. So, dear public, if you can hear my voice right now, what Mike Benz has just told us is that the right way to view all of these things is that warfare is no longer kinetic, at least if we can avoid it. The real warfare is soft power. There are people that fully understand the way that we are indoctrinated, whether it's music, education, arts, on, and they are finding ways to get money into those places through NGOs and the like, USAID being the most famous right now, of disseminating taxpayer dollars around the globe, under the guise of being philanthropic, but actually being soft power warfare, that these are effectively agents of, you were very careful to say they're not all agents of the government, but certainly what we're talking about right now, that some subset of them are agents of government foreign policy. And they are the one thing that we haven't really pulled in really tightly yet. But this idea of drafting off the policies, you've got these hedge funds that are like, hey, I have economic interests here. And the reason I don't think we've quite pulled that one in yet is you'll say we lost an election or we won an election, but we haven't defined exactly what that means. Like who, the blob, like who's considering it to be a win or a loss? I'm guessing the blob and Trump are sort of diametrically opposed. So would it be as simple as if the blob has won, Trump MAGA ideology has lost and vice versa? Like I get the economic part, but is there like a thing that guides the economic thing? Or is it just like, well, Soros happens to be shorting them today, and so we want them to lose. Oh, he's actually hoping this one to win, so we want them to win. That part I'm not entirely sure like how sort of one for one this is. Like, is this an economic battle where we use useful idiots on the ideological standpoint? Or is this an ideological standpoint that happens to get a lot easier when someone like Larry Fink, who I think of as using social movements as cover for economic gain, where he's like, oh, I'm just going to pull this green blanket on top of my investing strategy, and I just know what policies are going to get yeses, what policies are going to get no. I don't care if it's green or not. I just know green's an effective way for me to make more money. So if you can help us tease that out, whether ideology is driving this, whether economics are driving this, that would be, I think, really helpful.
Yeah, I would say economics. It's easy. There is a weird kind of democracy within the blob in the sense that you do have this big stakeholder soup. And the way foreign policy usually gets made is through a consensus of stakeholders within the kind of high net worth individual family class, the sort of folks who have effectively control over the hedge fund, private equity, big multinational corporation folks, and they all have different interests. The head of ExxonMobil is going to have different interests than the head of Walmart is going to have different interests than the head of a clean ethanol company, and their own power waxes and wanes over time. There was a time when the biggest game in town in the NGO world was the Ford Foundation by far. I mean, it was the biggest NGO. It worked very closely with the CIA, and it also had effectively controlling shares over the Ford Motor Company. And this is at a time when we were creating export markets for Ford cars, and this is a big part of it was tied into the petroleum world as well, but it's always been this way. But different stakeholders rise and fall in power over time as different industries and different alliances form and reform, and so we're in an interesting moment, I think, right now as the Biden administration alienated a lot of the traditional allies that were part of the kind of more left-leaning folks. And the Trump administration alienated many of those who are traditionally on the right. The Chamber of Commerce, for example, was traditionally a right-wing Republican institution representing all of the largest U.S. multinational businesses because they wanted free markets, low taxes, free enterprise, low regulation. And that was something that was typically associated with the Republican Party, and the Republicans and the Democrats would, offset that with media, unions, Hollywood, universities, and the kind of limousine liberal hedge fund class. And so, but Trump lost a significant amount of the Chamber of Commerce by articulating a foreign policy that was less interventionist, less war oriented, less money to these democracy building so-called, institutions that would secure markets for Chamber of Commerce companies. And so you saw a lot of, but all these things are a big soup. And so they move in tandem. George Soros doesn't really go in alone so much as he goes in with the Bill Browder, banker types from London, or he'll go in on, with the clean energy folks from, Al Gore's clean energy hedge fund. And you have these kind of consortiums, these kind of, alliance structures that pit against each other. And as elected leaders are favorable, or sometimes they start off favorable and then they become unfavorable, and then alliances shift from there. So, there is a kind of weird evolutionary democracy within the donor drafter class that ends up, what we see as politics is really kind of a proxy war that plays out within that network. It was obviously, for example, when Elon came in and supported Trump in the 2024 election, you can make the argument, and I love Elon. I mean, more than I can describe. I think he's truly a great man of history. The fact is, just looking at it under that same lens, Elon was aspiring to be a kind of conservative or centrist conservative Soros, and you would talk about Soros all the time. And Elon's businesses did benefit in the beginning. Certainly, I know that he's gone, to pay back a lot of the subsidies and his work to make his businesses independent. But the fact is Tesla benefited enormously from the coup in Bolivia for lithium in, this is like eight years ago now. And Elon was on Twitter, proud of that at the time. SpaceX got, rockets that were effectively intermediated in the very beginning from the State Department. SpaceX plays a major role in U.S. diplomatic and power projection. SpaceX had a role at the table when I was at the State Department, in charge of the cyber realm, and it's used in Starlink and the like. But the millions of dollars in subsidies for Tesla and SpaceX and the like. And so you can make an argument there was a donor drafter class side of that. It's simply the natural stable equilibrium of a capitalist democracy. And I'm not saying that to attack capitalism. I love capitalism. This simply is what it is in that sense. And you have to contend with it with the recognition that money absolutely helps. But sometimes there's only so much money can buy, because you can push things too far and no amount of propaganda will shift you from certain things. That's why they had to turn to censorship, because the propaganda, they couldn't turn it up past 10 anymore. So, they had to move to nastier toolkits. But I guess what I'm trying to say is you see this everywhere. George Soros was pushing this coup in Brazil against the Bolsonaro administration, and then went on to make, like $150 million from all of the government mandates to help Soros invested companies in Brazil, from the clean ethanol mandates that essentially hurt these, fossil fuel industries, while Soros was making giant long bets on clean energy, coups out the guy, who was the fossil fuel person, and then, rakes in from his own hedge fund, while his Open Society Institute is working with USAID to get everyone arrested who backs Bolsonaro, to get everyone censored on social media, to fund the union groups backing Bolsonaro. It ends up making a massive return on investment for Soros's own companies. It's the same thing in Ukraine, for example, with Naftogaz. All these companies partner with Naftogaz, and then they kick Russia out, and then they privatize Naftogaz under threat of IMF, loan tranches being cut off. And so the Soros empire makes hundreds of millions of dollars from that grand Ukraine energy play, which is enforced by the War Department, the State Department, USAID, CIA. And so, but this has always been, it's the same thing with Halliburton and Dick Cheney. It's the same thing with ExxonMobil in the entire 20th century. We had the CEO and chairman of ExxonMobil as the Secretary of State, if you remember, under Trump 1. It's the same thing with Walmart. Walmart, is a massive logistics and retail operation that relies on, if you look at Walmart, they sponsor all of these USAID lobby groups like the Global Leadership Coalition, and have made billions of dollars off the U.S. regime change. It's all the way down to Pizza Hut. Look, I played this on Joe Rogan when I was on there last time, and it's like, look at the Gorbachev Pizza Hut ad from the 1990s, where, Mikhail Gorbachev is in a friggin' Pizza Hut ad where you've got these different Russians who are complaining about how, they're not sure about how much they love this new capitalist system, and they're arguing that there's corruption, but then they turn to each other with Gorbachev smiling in the background. They say, but you know what? We've got Pizza Hut. Can't be that bad. And a big Pizza Hut ad. Well, Pizza Hut got 200 million new customers for Pizza Hut because the Department of War, the Department of State, USAID, and the CIA opened up that market for them. So everyone's got an interest in influencing these political systems. And, it's not something that you need to look at in a particularly conspiratorial way. This is just the way the world works. And once you accept that and kind of get past the shock and awe, it helps analyze things with just, this is the way the world works. And, if you start with that as a first principle, everything else makes sense from there, and you can draft your own strategy and policy recommendations accordingly.
If you're an aspiring entrepreneur with a dozen business ideas, but you're paralyzed because you don't know which one will actually make money, I can help you solve this problem in 30 minutes. The problem isn't that you don't have good ideas. I bet you have too many good ideas, and that's the problem. You can't make a decision. If you haven't tried my free Zero to Launch GPT yet, you are missing out. We've gotten incredible feedback from people who are finally launching their businesses using this tool. Kyle B, for instance, said it best when he said, "This custom GPT is lighting a fire in me." He went from not knowing how to maintain momentum to implementing a 10-week action plan that was so effective, he was having a hard time convincing himself to leave his workspace at the end of the day because he was getting so much done. This free custom GPT is personally trained on my proven framework. It will help you analyze the market and create an exact action plan to launch in just 30 minutes. Stop overthinking and start taking the steps to launch right now today. Click the link in the show notes to access the free Zero to Founder Launch GPT right now. All right, there is a lot of shock and awe in what you just said. Talk to me about censorship. This is one of the most shocking and awing things that in researching you for this interview that I came across. I always knew that Elon was a pivotal moment, him buying X, but I always assumed it was because he opened up free speech. I didn't realize that, and you tell me if you agree with this statement, but now after listening to you, my takeaway is that the reason that the Elon purchase of X was such a big deal was he broke the ability to feed the censorship machinery by limiting the amount that they could scrape X. So they couldn't in real time get a sense of the natural language that people were using and therefore couldn't censor fast enough. And so for me, as I look at the world, and I feel like something has come loose, man, like all of the uprisings everywhere, I'm like, what is driving this? Now, because my focus is so obsessively economic, I can give you the explanation for why people were feeling that way. But I couldn't have explained what the spark was that suddenly made it possible for them to all coordinate and all of that. Am I right to believe that that really broke free because we broke the censorship apparatus at an AI level?
That's a huge part of it. There are a lot of levels to the Elon revolution that started in late 2022, and immediately firing the trust and safety team there made it very difficult to actually enforce the censorship pressure that was being applied by these NGOs. The way it would work is the government would fund the NGOs. The NGOs would pressure the platforms through their trust and safety teams, simultaneously threatening advertiser boycotts to crush the revenue and hearings or regulatory enforcements from effectively the government, whether the executive or the legislative branch, so that it was economically not viable to disobey what the NGOs said. And this is the way it's always structured, by the way. For example, I mentioned earlier the Red Lines memo that was given to Zelensky in Ukraine, his first month in office. He in May 2019, the 20 red lines, the 70 NGOs undersigned a joint letter saying there will be political instability if you do any one of these 20 red lines. And it was security policy, economic policy, media policy, religious policies, basically everything in public policy in Ukraine. The head of state, the newly elected head of state, was threatened that if you chart your own course, you're going to be overthrown. And it's effectively what they said. They said it will lead to political instability, which is, it's threatening to destabilize the country if
Be
they
a real
do anything.
shame if we had to transition your government.
Right, but that wasn't delivered directly by the Secretary of State. That was delivered by what was called the Ukraine Crisis Media Center, which is still around today and played a weird role in the origins of Russiagate. But that was 70 NGOs who all moved together as one cohesive swarm. But what was the Ukraine Crisis Media Center funded by? It was funded by the U.S. State Department, USAID, about a dozen of these CIA NGO cutouts like Chemonics, and by NATO itself. So NATO sponsors the NGOs. The State Department, USAID, the CIA cutouts sponsor the NGOs. They swarm around and deliver this basically economic death knell message. If you don't do what we tell you to do, then you will be bankrupted. You'll be driven into the ground. We'll destabilize you.
Why do they care so much? Is this like they're just trying to alienate Russia?
Well, Russia sits on $75 trillion worth of natural resources.
So this is a long-term play to fuck Russia up enough that they can get in there and get access to the resources?
It's been one, yes. This was we fought the Cold War arguably over this, and the entire 30 years post-Cold War has been NATO expansion, country after country after country after country. Even after we promised Gorbachev, NATO will not expand 1 inch to the east. James Baker in 1990, made that promise, and now NATO is expanding all the way to Russia's doorstep. This is moving country after country into the security and political and economic vassalage where we incrementally eat up these resources. But it's a condition of joining NATO that you need to have all these reforms put in place. You need to have open media, which does not mean open media, right? It means we need to be able to influence the hearts and minds in your country. You have to buy from NATO contractors. You have to make all these reforms to your rule of law and judicial independence. That doesn't mean you have independent judges. That means you have judges who come through USAID incubator programs like the World Justice Project or the American Bar Association USAID program. So you turn over your control to the blob in order to get folded into this, and then you become a giant military base so that Russia doesn't is not able to fight back. But essentially, it's a play for natural resources. It's a play for the minerals and the rare earths and the oil and the gas and the cobalt and the lithium and the aluminum and the gold and the wheat and the agriculture and it's the biggest prize on earth. Russia has almost twice as much natural resources as the United States does. Wow. And that was our unipolar moment in the 1990s when we almost had control over Russia. We did under Boris Yeltsin, then we lost under Putin, and that's why Putin's become this Hitlerite boogeyman that you're just kind of psyoped into having to say incantations about how you hate him so much, because he cost billions of dollars to a lot of very significant stakeholders in American politics. But anyway, that's a bit of an aside. But the point that I'm trying to build towards here is you have this democracy of stakeholders, and it's always been like this. Now, in a sense, on the censorship story, the problem was the internet changed everything. The internet democratized media, and so you couldn't do what you did in the 20th century when all of the major media outlets had some legacy connections to the Office of War Information or to the U.S. State Department Bureau of Public Diplomacy, or to the CIA, or to the State Department CIA NGO world. You could have genuinely independent citizen journalists and influencers who had more impact on hearts and minds than the media pawns of the blob. And suddenly what some random 24-year-old video gamer like PewDiePie or something in 2016, what he said about the election swayed more hearts and minds than the New York Times. And I remember it was at the German Marshall Fund, I think in 2019, where I think it was John Allen, who was a 4-star general. He ended up being the head of Brookings, but he identified hate speech online as one of the top 3 biggest geopolitical threats in the entire world. This is a 4-star military general and effectively a CIA cutout NGO, saying that because hate speech gives rise to ethno-nationalism, which gives rise to nationalism, which gives rise to things like Brexit and potentially Frexit and Italexit and Grexit, which is going to dissolve the EU, which is going to dissolve NATO, which is going to destroy the entire rules-based international order. Because, kids in Call of Duty were able to use strong language with each other freely. And one of the things he said in that talk was like, imagine a world where the New York Times is reduced to a medium-sized Facebook page. And it was like this thought experiment to the room of all these military generals and CIA, case officer types and, NGO leaders of giant media conglomerates. And they're all having to take in like, wait, play this forward a couple of years. What happens if the New York Times is really just a medium-sized Facebook page? How do we maintain the rules-based international order if we can't determine elections in most of the world's countries?
That's crazy. I don't know if I love that or hate that. And we'll get to it in a minute because we need to wrap up the censorship thing. But just to plant a flag for people, one of the most interesting questions that you've asked that we need to answer in this interview is, while it is unnerving that we are being manipulated as much as we are, and we want transparency, we also want global power. And we don't want America to be toothless in the face of international powers that will leverage all of these same things against us. So anyway, we will get to that. I want to plant that as something that we are building towards. So wrap up the censorship part for me, either by explaining the Elon thing, my take on that as just being foolish, or explaining how and why that has been so transformational that not letting them scrape enough data in real time fundamentally change something on a global scale. That's my hypothesis.
Yes. Well, that was, what you're referring to are these weapons of mass deletion, these AI censorship capabilities to be able to, in real time, control narratives. This was just like with almost everything else we've talked about. This was a military project that started off, arguably going back to the Google days. Google started as a DARPA project. It was called the Massive Digital Data Systems Program, when Sergey Brin and Larry Page were Stanford PhDs. They got grant money from this DARPA program, which was a joint CIA-NSA program, in order to track how, quote, birds of a feather flock together online in the mid-1990s. This was at the time when Web 1.0, or during the search engine wars, before Google completely dominated the field. You had Lycos and Ask Jeeves, and there were dozens of these, and they were all competing for market share. And the CIA and NSA were trying to use search traffic in foreign countries as a early warning political radar system. And so they funded, I think it was called Backpage, the Google predecessor at Stanford, in order to map speech online and use that for statecraft and intelligence purposes. And then when social media came about in 2004 with Facebook, 2005 with YouTube, 2006 with Twitter, and then 2007 with the smartphone, this social media immediately became the main game. This happened through this very, very unique individual named Jared Cohen, who was on the policy planning staff at the State Department and convinced the State Department and CIA to use social media for color revolution and counterinsurgency work because it was much more scalable and speedy and comprehensive than running operations out of U.S. embassies or consulates or CIA station houses. You could mobilize rent-a-riots or street revolutions or access hearts and minds way more effectively and at scale on social media than you could through the traditional analog, everybody show up to this church on, 3rd and sundown at 12 p.m. and you get 20 people as opposed to 200,000 people if you do it on Twitter or Facebook or YouTube organizing. And so, but then as that ecosystem on social media matured, there just became huge amounts of data to analyze in order to be able to run successful operations and to counter various political movements or counterintelligence threats. And so the military worked on this technique called natural language processing, NLP, which is a way to create these machine learning models. These essentially you take any political narrative or any political movement and you take all the associated keywords, the slangs, you do a linguistic mapping. And so it's essentially there's a kind of political science sociology element to it to create a code book, a lexicon, the prefixes, the suffixes, the slogans, the hashtags, the dialect. You can tweak these things with what's called sentiment analysis in terms of the proximity of different constellation of words together. Then you have your computer scientists, your quants, essentially plug that code book, that linguistic lexicon and constantly updated keywords, into this model. You ingest hundreds of millions in 2020 to censor, for example, opposition to mail-in ballots or early voting drop boxes or electronic voting machines. This group, EIP, ingested 859 million tweets during that election cycle in order to conclude that 22 million of them were misinformation. That's not manually reading 22 million, and then the U.S. government funded all this. This started off to stop. The military justified building this field of AI censorship because of ISIS recruiting, allegedly on Twitter and Facebook in 2014, 2015, during the Garland attack in Texas and the attacks in France and the like. They said we need to stop ISIS. And we just can't stop them fast enough. So we need to create this linguistic code book of how they talk to each other and the words they use. And then essentially when Trump won the 2016 election, all of this money, billions of dollars of investment from the State Department, USAID, the Civil Affairs branch of the U.S. military, it went into stopping Russian disinformation, which is now the bigger threat than ISIS. And then they simply said, Trump supporters are Russian, are a Russian operation. And so
what came first, though? Were they upset about Trump and they were actually trying to stop him? And so Russia becomes just the thing we're going to use? Or was Russian interference actually hyper prevalent and they were just addressing that and it happened to impact Trump?
No, it was the first one. They never proved anything about the Russian influence. In fact, it was a total joke. The Justice Department dropped all of its cases against the so-called Russian bot farms. The people who were identifying the Russian bots themselves got caught creating Russian bots, like New Knowledge. If you just look at the New York Times write-up, for example, on the New Knowledge scandal, where the same group that wrote the Senate intelligence report on Russian interference on social media was creating fake Russian bots and subscribing them to Roy Moore's Republican Senate campaign, and then going to the media and saying, "Look, they're being backed by Russian bots." And the media reporting it without having any idea that the very group that told them they were being backed by Russian bots created those Russian bots. You just buy a bot farm and you set the VPN to Russia. Now suddenly you've got your Russian bots. But this was a giant predicate. Without the Russia side of it, none of this could have been ever created in the first place. Before this got normalized with COVID, and disinformation was a threat to democracy, they had to use a foreign. They had to break 2.5 centuries of free speech precedents in this country, and they did this with a national security hammer. They said, "Well, listen, this is a national security threat. This is not like a free speech issue at all. This is a hostile foreign malign influence operation. So who is our agency to stop hostile foreign malign influence threats? It's the Central Intelligence Agency." So just like that, the CIA gets to move into Facebook. The CIA gets to move into Twitter. The CIA gets to move into YouTube. The ODNI gets to, work with the back end of the trust and safety team everywhere. All of the CIA and State Department, USAID-funded NGOs get billions of dollars in grants to stop this darn Russian threat. which is only backing Trump supporters. And now we're reporting tens of thousands of ordinary course Trump supporters because our definition of a bot is anyone who has, spews misdis or malinformation about NATO while posting 20 or more times a day. So it's like everyone was a bot under that definition. If you look at the way the German Marshall Fund, funded by USAID and the State Department, defined a bot, it was literally as simple as that. It was like, consistently amplified Russian talking points while posting consistently 20 or more times a day. It was like, that's half of Trump's supporters. And nobody gets to check the math. Nobody gets to see actually how the digital forensics are cooked up. They just see, well, it's a Russian bot. I don't know anything about digital forensics. I guess maybe these are Russian bots. And the fact is the Trump administration, a lot of Republican media didn't have a problem with this because their opponents were getting censored. Fox News's opponents were getting censored. A lot of big Republican accounts were being challenged from the bottom up by pro-Trump media. And it wasn't until Trump himself got hit that, and I can say this definitively as Trump's speechwriter at this time, and I wrote a speech for Trump about censorship in the summer of 2020. And he explicitly he declined to read it. He got halfway through the introductions and looked down and said, everyone says censorship's this big deal. It's but let them try to stop me. They tried to stop me before, and it's like, I mean, they really were completely unprepared. And at the time, I think they didn't want to go after big tech because it was what was making the stock market so successful as the Trump campaign was running for re-election. They were saying MAGAs, Microsoft, Apple, Google, and Amazon. And so no one wanted to, touch the golden goose. And the goose got cooked.
Woof. Now, do you think that there was something unique about Trump that made the blob unified in wanting to censor him and his proponents? Or is it whoever was in power in what I call the deep state? I'm not trying to put those words in your mouth, but that feels like the right term to me. That whoever was in control of the deep state at that moment has a new technology, and they're just like, oh, we've got a new technology. This guy won. We certainly weren't expecting that. We don't want it to happen again. So we're going to shut him down. Like if the roles were reversed, would the deep state have used that tool against a Democrat or?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. They were using this against Bernie people at the time. Now, you remember Bernie Sanders in 2016 was a whole different animal than he is now. I mean, Bernie is folded on all of this stuff. He's a lawn chair. He just folds up whenever anyone sits on it. But in 2016, Bernie he almost beat Hillary for the Democrat nomination. They had to use all these, super elector, all these different tricks in order to, ensure Hillary carried the DNC nomination. Even within that, there were these Bernie bros. But you can listen to people like Anders Fogh Rasmussen, who was the head of NATO during the Obama administration, and was a huge force, but behind the censorship industrial complex. He effectively created the censorship industrial complex through NATO setting it up after 2014 in Ukraine, and then rolling it into the UK after Brexit, and then the US after Trump won. And Anders Fogh Rasmussen in 2015, 2016 was on TV all the time talking about Trump and Bernie, threats to democracy. They went after Jeremy Corbyn in the UK Labour Party the same way. It doesn't matter. It's not a partisan thing. It's a blob thing. Bernie Sanders was calling to cut the Pentagon budget and foreign interventionism to all this color revolution and democracy building and war work because he wanted the money to be spent on universal health care and free college tuition. It was Jeremy Corbyn was calling for the same thing out of the UK Labour Party. And then they regime changed him out and put Keir Starmer in. And now Keir Starmer, is completely destroying the United Kingdom and whatever freedom is left there. But it's just a foreign policy thing. And you brought up something earlier, which is you mentioned BlackRock and Larry Fink. And I feel like maybe circling back to that now is kind of an opportune moment, because if you look at like the biggest influence lobby for USAID and the international affairs budget in DC, it's this group called the Global Leadership Coalition. It was set up in 1995 at a time when the American public was trying to scale back State Department and USAID and U.S. Agency for Global Media and Pentagon funds because the Cold War was over. And so a bunch of multinational corporations all get together with the NGOs. You had these like Republican multinational corporations at the time in the 1990s. This is before the Trump split. And you had these left-wing NGOs who were all on government, grants, getting together. They called this a coalition of strange bedfellows. So you had the Republican big business and the Democrat, big nonprofit complex come together to create this GLC, Global Leadership Coalition, which came to be their lobbying arm in Congress, on the Hill, in local and state and national races for politics, to make sure that everybody in DC keeps funding USAID. In fact, gives them more money than ever. Keeps funding the State Department, keeps funding the Pentagon, keeps funding the U.S. Agency for Global Media, keeps funding the National Endowment for Democracy, keeps funding the Carnegie Endowment, keeps funding the Ford Foundation, keeps funding the Bill and Melinda Gates Fund through the international affairs budget, even though the Cold War was over. Even though, and this, on the board of the GLC right now is a guy named Tom Donilon. And I bring this up because you mentioned BlackRock. Well, BlackRock has an in-house think tank that it guides the $10 trillion worth of assets under management at BlackRock, and it's called the BlackRock Investment Institute. Its chairman is Tom Donilon. Tom Donilon was the national security advisor for Barack Obama. So it's the head of military intelligence and statecraft. That's the guy the president meets with every day, more than the Secretary of State. It's the head of the National Security Council. Before that, Tom Donilon was a high-level State Department operative in the 1990s responsible for NATO expansion. In between that, he won the CIA Directors Award and had a very prominent role in U.S. intelligence, but he'd never been a banker until, basically past his 50th birthday. Then suddenly he becomes the head of the BlackRock Investment Institute and sits on the board of the lobby on Capitol Hill to give more money to the international affairs budget, which then BlackRock drafts off of for all of its portfolio company investments. So if they're invested in Halliburton, and Halliburton has the rights to the oil processing and infrastructure development in eastern Ukraine, they can make sure that U.S. taxpayer money is going to fund the military reconquest of eastern Ukraine and the State Department pressure in order to privatize Naftogaz or to give the government contracts to BlackRock portfolio companies. And Tom Donilon, by the way, was Joe Biden's first pick for CIA director. This is reported by the New York Times. Tom Donilon turned it down. He said, he would rather run the BlackRock Investment Institute than but it's the same job. It's simply making a lot more money because they get to control the lobbying arm in order to make sure the money keeps going to BlackRock. And then Tom Donilon's brother, Mike Donilon, was the top White House senior advisor to Joe Biden and had been since 1986 for 40 years. Joe Biden's kitchen sink, or kitchen cabinet, they call it, not the cabinet of secretaries, but the close inner circle at the White House. The most important person in the kitchen cabinet was Mike Donilon, who was his political groomer for 40 years. And it's the brother of the guy running the investment decisions at BlackRock. So think about, but this is like national security. This is like insider trading on national security secrets. It's the same thing George Soros has been doing. It's the same thing the Donilons do. It's the same thing all of these people that they're in the. I mean, you got the guy who was first picked to be CIA director. Won the CIA Directors Award, was the national security advisor. And now he's the head of the Investment Institute for BlackRock. Well, he's got an immediate line. You can just call Big Brother and immediately know, what the White House is going to do on Ukraine. And so he can decide whether or not to invest in rare earths or mining or natural gas or agriculture. And he can do that. But this is why they all bid on these guys. What is Mark Milley right now? Mark Milley, Arch Blobster, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, four-star general. He's a banker now. He's at JP Morgan Chase. How about Jared Cohen, who I mentioned, who established the CIA protocol for using social media for color revolutions when he was at the State Department policy planning staff in 2007 and convinced Condoleezza Rice to run CIA operations out of Facebook instead of CIA station houses. Well, he then went to Google and then worked with the CIA and State Department at Google through Google Jigsaw. What's he doing now? He's at Goldman Sachs running the geopolitical futures and macroeconomic trading strategy. All of these blobsters go into banking because the multinational corporation profit strategy is to use the battering ram of the War Department, the State Department, the CIA, USAID, and all this media control to maximize their own profits. And Trump threatened to throw a monkey wrench in that by daring to have a different foreign policy, being unvetted by these little CIA incubator programs at NED, like all the other Republicans were. And the media control has been threatened by free speech on the internet. It just the power of one small voice amplifying all the other minnows has turned out to be a more powerful force than a shark. So now we're in that world where we've had all the success here in the U.S., but now they're moving upstream with international law to try to make it so that even if we want to have free speech, it'll be illegal under international law or foreign country jurisdictions like the UK, EU, Brazil.
Okay, there is something interesting going on there in terms of the EU leveraging their own laws to try to influence what social media does. Because if you make something illegal there, then now it's like, okay, do we just stop doing this everywhere? Or is there a vulnerability that's created in terms of how much data we have to hand over in the EU? So I'm going to set that aside for a second, though, because the thing that I really want to understand, and I will be mortified if we get to the end of this interview and we haven't tackled, which is what is going on right now. And I'll be specific about what I mean by that. So I said earlier, for me, looking at what's happening in the world right now from a populist uprising standpoint, just through an economic lens, I can explain precisely why people are in a populist sentiment. But the specific thing that's yanking us, the left in one direction and the right in another direction, that I don't have mapped. And so I would love to understand, when I look at what's going on in Nepal, when I look at the UK, when I look at the response here in America to Charlie Kirk, what's going on in Germany, what's going on in Italy, like there is, to me, a theme that runs through it all. When I saw people in the UK marching in the streets for the Tommy Robinson protest, holding Charlie Kirk like vigils and signs, I was like, hold on a second. This is what looks like to me to be a singular phenomena just playing out all over. When I start to make that specific, though, I know that I am reaching in the dark. So I'll say what I think it is, but I would love for you to say if you think that this is crazy or what. But the specific phenomenon to me seems to be that we have the blob putting forward what I'll call a progressive agenda, just to be as neutral about it as I can. And that's been going on now for quite some time, possibly a reaction to Trump and what that represents. But you've got that pulling the left in that direction as fast and hard as you can. And then on the right, you have what I'll call is a rebound effect to those voices being pushed down. And I think that there's an evolutionary reason why it breaks left and right that my audience will have heard me talk about a gazillion times, so I won't bother relaying that out. But the very shorthand of it all is evolution realizes to create a stable society, you need both the deeply compassionate left and you need the personal responsibility right. And so you're always going to have those two voices. So if you push one of them down, like holding a inflated ball underwater, as soon as you take the pressure off, it's going to pop back up. And so when Elon came in and made it impossible for the censorship apparatus to work because you just couldn't scrape enough data, that was the hand off the ball, and boom, it's just popping up, and it's popping up here, it's popping up in Germany, it's popping up in the UK. Obviously, there are real policy reasons for that, shorthanded to unchecked immigration. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. So that's my sort of rough approximation of the specifics that are pulling us left and right. What's your take on the connective tissue between all these theoretically disparate uprisings?
Well, quick thing on the scraping of data. It's important to, I think, for maybe your audience, just because it's kind of a legal technical thing they may not have heard, but this new EU censorship law actually compels U.S. social media platforms to hand over this data to what they call vetted researchers, which are just basically all these little CIA, MI6 cutout organizations. These same NGOs are now under threat of billions of dollars in fines, are going to be able to get back the raw materials to be able to boot the Death Star back up in terms of narrative control, unless the U.S. State Department and White House can step in and stop the Europeans. And that's what stalled the trade deal currently. The economic trade deal between the U.S. and the EU has been stalled. I would say, thankfully, and I'm very grateful that this administration is so passionate about defending America from foreign free speech threats that they're willing to. I think a lot of Trump donors would much prefer to have the trade deal and don't necessarily even care about the free speech issue, but
so short-sighted.
They're putting the country first, which is incredible to see. In terms of the kind of political left-right of it, it's really interesting when the blob is so weirdly political and apolitical at the same time. It is fundamentally apolitical, but it manifests itself as political from season to season. Like a great example of this is Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine in I believe it was 2013, 2014, I believe Democrats put a resolution in Congress forbidding any government funds from going to the Azov battalion because they were right-wing neo-Nazis. So this is one of these Ukrainian factions. There's a very kind of ethno-nationalist strand within some of the Ukrainian nationalist movements. A lot of this goes back to, kind of the immediate post-World War II era kind of times and just how things developed. But essentially, Ukrainians were seen the most militant, most aggressive, most willing to die for their country. Ukrainians were rejected by Democrats in 2014, pre-Russian counter-coup, because they were, Nazis and hard ultranationalist right-wing types. Then, when the Democrats needed them to serve as muscle against the Russians after the U.S. State Department under Barack Obama lost control over the oblasts and lost control over pretty much everything east of the Dnieper River, everything in Crimea through the referendum. Suddenly, we needed the loudest, craziest, most aggressive military battalion folks in Ukraine. And so Democrats began funding them. Magically, Facebook, which had banned the Azov battalion, not just banned them, but banned anyone from talking about them in a favorable way. They after I think in around 2016, 2017, Facebook designated the Azov Battalion as a dangerous organization, which not just forbids them from having access to Facebook or Instagram, but means that you can't glorify them without yourself committing a terms of service. You could only mention them in the context of condemning them. But as soon as the 2022 conflict broke out, all of that reversed. Suddenly, Democrats were backing, effectively Nazi groups. And I would not be surprised if the Victoria Nuland Political Affairs State Department leaned on Facebook to remove them from the dangerous organizations group and allow them to not just get back on Facebook and Instagram, but allow everyone to support them around the world.
Wow, that's so
And then they're getting
mercenary.
standing ovations from the Democrats but a lot of this is because George Soros's economic interests were threatened to be destroyed by the Russian incursion into Ukraine, and all of the massive energy play around the Ukrainian gas market. I mean, this was what Burisma was. Burisma was a Ukrainian gas company funded by USAID. You could have Democrat-aligned Wall Street and London investors making money off of this grand Ukraine energy play being administered by the Obama State Department. But so it's not really like you will have progressives funding Nazis and you will have Republicans funding Bangladeshi transgender rap groups. Like I mentioned, that was not the radical far left side of the CIA doing the funding of the Bangladeshi rap groups, to oust their conservative government. That was the Republican side of the. I'm not convinced that the same people who are funding Bangladeshi rappers, would like to live next door to them or would like their daughter to meet them in church. They want the petroleum. They want the military bases, and they are quite agnostic on both sides, whether that's the Democrat side of the blob funding right-wing nationalist movements, or it's the Republican side of the blob funding, left-wing street anarchists. If it's what creates the necessary power vacuum to secure their own economic interests, things can stabilize from there. You can bet, for example, that after the Nazi faction in Ukraine outlives its usefulness, the gay pride parades will be back and forth. So you can bet, after a left wing, coup in Bangladesh, you're going to have the IRI putting in pressure for a kind of strongman type to contain the anarchic forces who are complaining about fossil fuels. But you need to create that power vacuum first, which means working with strange bedfellows to do it. And this is the exact lobbying force behind USAID and the War Department and the State Department and media control funds in the first place.
All right. So it is that schizophrenic nature creating the wild bifurcation. So if you think that I'm shoehorning something here, please tell me. But I look at Charlie Kirk getting shot. I see it as somebody who, whether he grew up Republican or not, becomes irrelevant in the face of being radicalized, and seems like it was somebody who has been radicalized to left-leaning ideology. Is this just like, no, it is what it is. Like, it's collateral damage. We're not intentionally trying to build any sort of long-standing divide. We just, in any one moment, we need this, and then the next moment we need that. But these things take on a life of their own. And so we've just got these two sides racing away from each other. Like, what is causing that? Like, why? How have we gotten to a place where silence is violence, words are violence, people that say a thing that I don't like get shot and killed? Like, it's, I am very eager to have an answer for that so that I can make whatever small contribution I make by talking into a microphone to begin unwinding that. But I have to understand it before I can unwind it. And if it's collateral damage from the system of soft power around the world where it's all hearts and minds all the time, but it's completely mercenary and therefore there's no like real ideology, and any ideological derailment of the train, like what I'm saying we're seeing right now, is purely accidental. At least I know. But like, what do you think? What do you think about that hypothesis? Is there something that better explains what we're seeing?
I don't have a fully formed opinion yet on what to attribute the Charlie assassination to beyond that shooter and the local community, for example, in Salt Lake, that it appears the FBI is looking into this armed queers group and folks who appear to have foreknowledge of it and the like. There's a lot to be said about how those groups have served as pawns of U.S. foreign policy for a very, very long time. I mean, the CIA was working with Antifa groups in Syria during Operations Timber Sycamore. If you just look up Antifa Syria Operation Timber Sycamore, I've talked for years before this happened about how the transgender population is disproportionately sought after by the State Department and by intelligence-linked NGOs because they are the frontline radicals who are often very quick to be the frontline muscle to take to the streets against governments. You're looking for crazy people. You are when you are trying to start a revolution, you need bodies in the streets, and you need people who are willing to take big risks, who are willing to get arrested. I mean, I'm literally just reciting to you right now the U.S. Institute of Peace call to arms. I mean, they literally, I have videos on my X accounts of their own civil resistance guidebooks, 300-page guidebooks on how to plan a revolution, and how and they have an online video series with 170 videos about how to do this. This is funded by us, the taxpayers. It was created by the Reagan administration in 1984 during the Cold War, right after the National Endowment for Democracy. And they explicitly say, like, we train people to get arrested, to become martyrs for the cause. We look at the different protest movement demographics by their risk tolerance, and we need most younger people have a higher risk tolerance, and people who are unemployed, or people who are on drugs, or people who are criminals, or people who are transgender tend to have a much higher risk tolerance. They tend to go in after, they have oftentimes a very serious hatred of a government that they feel not included by or not representative, or they feel like in the event of a revolution, their lives would be dramatically better because they would get to set the terms of what's normative or not in society. And so they are easily poached, they're easily bought, they're easily radicalized. And this is how you have, for example, the Republican side of the CIA funding transgender dance festivals in Bangladesh, or just giving out money in Haiti to LGBT groups. Just give them out. Just literally. I mean, I think one of the State Department grants that I showed was in the Caribbean and the name of the grant was just being LGBT, just money for that. But you end up getting lots of arts and culture and university and youth radicalization through that. When I look at how those are used in armed revolutions in the past 10 years, I think, look at something like Pussy Riot, which was working on the same kind of, LGBT kind of like gender fluid type. This was funded by USAID, housed by the National Endowment for Democracy. The lead singer is appearing at the State Department at the podium with Tony Blinken and actively, deliberately fomenting riots on the streets of Russia. This is what ended up getting USAID kicked out of Russia, I should note, under Barack Obama when they tried to do this left-wing, sexual profanity riots. I mean, it's in the name. The name of the group was Pussy Riot. But what I'm getting at here is I know that there's a tendency I'll give you an example. With the Ryan Routh thing, I immediately saw the network. Right, day one, I recorded a 4-hour live stream and immediately found that this individual was connected. Now, not saying that he was a mastermind. Ryan Routh, the Trump attempted assassination after Butler, was clearly a crazy person. But that doesn't, folks underweigh the crazies that are worked with. I mean, you talk to special forces guys, anyone who's been in the operations side of CIA, or anyone who's been in the political affairs division of state, crazies are very, very, very useful. They are party starters. They start the spark. They have a lot of energy. They are willing to be you get enough of them together, you got a protest movement, and oftentimes because they're crazy, they're not able to hold down a regular job. So NGO grant money goes a long, long way because it's their alternative to being homeless or being, in a very desperate state. And so they're very loyal in that sense as well. But what I'm getting at with Ryan Routh, that was an individual who was doing the kind of thing you can't do unauthorized legally. This was somebody who was working directly with the U.S. State Department to get terrorist fighters into Ukraine from Afghanistan, Syria, Iran, Libya. He was getting ISIS. He was getting military fighters into all of these conflict zones, spending his entire day trawling WhatsApp, Telegram, Facebook in order to get stacks. He claimed to have over 5,000 front and back passports of ISIS and Al-Qaeda fighters, and then working with the U.S. State Department to get them no-look fast-pass visas so that they could serve as cannon fodder for the NATO war against Russia at the same time that we were working, that there was a serendipitous flood of folks from Afghanistan and Syria as top-up muscle to the Ukrainian military in Ukraine, while Ryan Routh had a business card saying he was the director of a Ukraine NGO, the Ukraine Volunteer Center. Forget the exact name, but essentially the Volunteer Center of Ukraine, I think is what it was called, which itself was a dark money NGO. So we don't know whether it was directly sponsored by USAID, but it got its 501c3 as a American nonprofit through this other group called Mother of Ukraine, which was profiled by Voice of America, literally a CIA media proprietary that was spun off from the CIA in the 1970s. And it's still U.S. government media. The whole thing is like, running through this government money, government media nexus. And Ryan Routh, he's like, you've got military fighters, these intelligence networks from Timber Sycamore in Syria. You have the State Department through the visas. You have the USAID through the NGOs. He gets picked up by DHS in 2023, and Customs and Border Patrol calls for DHS to investigate him because the story doesn't check out, and they refuse to investigate him. The guy's been arrested 50 times but never spent a day in jail. The Ryan Routh connections to the blob are immediately apparent. You have Trump was running against what the blob wanted on Ukraine, and we don't know how deep it goes in terms of who within the blob may have had advanced knowledge, but that this was a blob creation. This was a guy whose entire life was serving the blob's military and financial interests in Ukraine, day in, day out, and it was a political assassination attempt for that purpose. And now the Justice Department has classified all the new evidence in the Ryan Routh case, so we don't even now, and I'm speculating, but I presume this is because a lot of that evidence about Routh's motivations and his prior life is going to flow through this NGO network in Ukraine that he was a part of. And they don't want the world or the American public necessarily knowing. I think you could undermine the war effort if it turns out that all these NGOs had intelligence links. And so now it's classified as a matter of grave national security. We're not allowed to know the new evidence in the Ryan Routh case. That is a very clean one to me. I don't know about Tyler Robinson yet. Obviously, the way it's looking is, it looks Antifa. It looks classic, anti-fascist, the engravings and the like. We know that, or at least it's been reported by the FBI, he had a transgender boyfriend at the same time. I believe the transgender boyfriend, it's being reported now. I don't know when this comes out if this will hold up, but I think that the transgender boyfriend is actually cooperating with the FBI or may have played some role in turning him in conjunction with the father. Right now, my focus, as things currently are, is trying to make sure that the institutional response to this is correct in terms of honoring Charlie's legacy. We've seen, lots of that, whether it's NASCAR, the UFC, the Chicago Cubs, the New York Yankees, the Dallas Cowboys, 38,000 new TPUSA applications for both colleges and high schools. I would like to see a TPUSA chapter in every American high school. If that's the end result of this, that would go an unbelievable way to stopping this mind virus we're seeing around this, because people get radicalized in college. It looks like Tyler Robinson was radicalized in college. It looks like he came from a Republican Trump supporting family and then went off to college and you became an Antifa, furry, transgender adjacent crazy person. If there had been a TPUSA in his high school and he had a community that he could fit in with, because it's the thing, if you call yourself a conservative on a college campus that doesn't have a TPUSA, you're socially ostracized. You can't get a date. You can't have friends. You have no one to support you. And TPUSA completely changed the game on that. And so I'm delighted to see that play out. And the institutional response, I think, has been very positive. But the folks who are condoning assassination, that's FBI stuff right there. You can't call for assassination of your political opponents. That's incitement to murder, and we can root that out now.
You're the king of pulling everything into the spotlight. Sunshine is the best disinfectant. But how do we make sure that America doesn't end up losing its teeth on the international stage? How do we have both?
You can simply use transparency. And I'll give you an example. The National Endowment for Democracy that we talked about, this CIA cutout funded by the State Department that moves in conjunction with the Central Intelligence Agency on everything it does. It, at least in the beginning, arguably when it was most effective in its first 20 years, it used to say it does overt action instead of covert action, unlike the CIA, which hides all of its operations, and you're not allowed to see who the CIA funds. And, they could at least make the claim that it was overt action in the beginning. Now it's covert. It's completely covert. I can't FOIA it. I can't get access. Even the White House can't get access. And there's a battle about that right now. It's, congressional oversight couldn't get access when and it's the same thing with USAID. USAID is more secretive than the CIA. And that's everyone always laughs or thinks I'm joking when I say that, but it's way more secretive than the CIA. The president of the United States has to issue a presidential finding, a written authorization of every single CIA covert action. USAID has none of those restrictions. So you can just run covert operations out of USAID. And then you can completely fool people with a grant description that bears no resemblance to anything that USAID does or did. Like the Zunzaneo case. I talk about this all the time, but it bears repeating. If you went on usaspending.gov, the Zunzaneo grant, this was the Cuban regime change operation from 2009 to 2014, when the USAID, in tandem with the CIA, constructed a fake Twitter knockoff named after the Cuban slang for hummingbird, in order to recruit 100,000 Cubans onto a fake Twitter application at a time when Cuba had banned Twitter, in order to get them to do a Cuban Spring, like the CIA got the riots popped off during the Arab Spring. They wanted to lure, according to USAID, they wanted to lure them in with promise of a social media platform focused on sports, music, and hurricane updates. But then after they hit about 100,000 subscribers, they would sow discord and distrust and promote basically users to do revolutions against police and against the security state and take to the streets and riot. And this is all in the USA documents, but the grant was earmarked for humanitarian relief in Pakistan. So it bears no relation whatsoever to what was actually done. Like, take, USAID's Save the Children operation. Save the Children is a British NGO for public health and childhood vaccines. It's also has an American side of it, but it's centered in London, but it's a frequent USAID partner. In 2012, the CIA tapped USAID to collect the biometrics of the Pakistani population through save the children by having the USAID. So the CIA gets the USAID mission representative to recruit doctors at Save the Children for childhood vaccines, and then convince local doctors in Pakistan to collect the biometrics of the local Pakistan population so that it could be analyzed by the CIA for them to match, with who they called potential terrorists. So now you've got USAID corrupting a childhood vaccine NGO for a CIA operation to collect people's blood. Like, you can't do foreign policy this way. They got busted by Pakistani intelligence. I believe the doctors associated with that are still in jail. This is something that was when the CIA got busted in this, and it took them 18 months to issue a declaration that they would know that the CIA would no longer use vaccine clinics for CIA operations. Well, USAID never said that they'd stop doing it. What the solution is not to get rid of, in my view, I'm not calling for an end to dirty work, but you can make dirty work a little less dirty. There are certain things you can't do anymore. There are certain things that are too much. One of the things that came out of the reforms of the CIA in the 60s and 70s is we put an end to assassinations. Can't do that anymore. Used to now look. Okay, technically, yeah, the CIA runs the drone program, so technically the CIA does assassinations every day. But it was, at least you have some process around the who's on the terrorist list and whether or not in the first 30 years of it, it was a Wild West. You didn't need presidential sign off, which meant that the president could have plausible. There was a whole power dynamic within the CIA is, do we tell the president that we're going to do this? Well, maybe the president actually doesn't want us to tell him that we're doing this, because then he wants to maintain plausible deniability, and it's our job to have plausible deniability. And so there became this whole sub game within it to hide from all the other branches of government what the CIA was doing. And as USAID took over more and more of the CIA portfolio, USAID hides from Congress. They told, for example, in the Zunzuneo case under Obama, that the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee, they told the senior investigator, the head of oversight, the senior staffer in charge of oversight, who himself was named, won an award for top CIA analyst before he moved over to the Senate side. They said, you're not allowed to know anything about the Zunzuneo operation, or else people could die. Because if somebody leaks from the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, then the whole network could be busted. And so the Senate's not allowed to know. The National Security Council's not allowed to know. FOIA investigators aren't allowed to know. So what happens is you have soft power that people are paying for in the United States without knowing what the heck they're paying for, because there's no internal process for containing the corruption. And so then you get these crazy stories where they're giving out $550 million of kickbacks to their own friends because no one's allowed to do oversight. And so the USAID grew in large part because handcuffs were put on the CIA in the 70s. This is when USAID really began to take off and grow to have a 3 times bigger budget than the CIA. We are now at that moment where USAID, whatever function it continues to have at state, needs the handcuffs. And there will be a moment where all these other little USAID adjacent places, like the Export-Import Bank, the Development Finance Corporation, and the U.S. Agency for Global Media, which are still technically alive, there's going to be this flow to attempt corruption and setting your own foreign policy in line. And we're going to need to be vigilant and whack-a-mole to stop that. But USAID needs to go through the process that the CIA did in the 70s, and then we'll contain the damage and reform the institutions from there.
It's a wild moment, Mr. Benz. It is a wild moment. Where can people follow you? This has been incredible, and I imagine many of them are going to want more.
Thanks. You can follow me on X at Mike Benz Cyber. I'm also on YouTube and Rumble and Instagram. It's Mike Benz Cyber everywhere.
I love it, man. Thank you so much. Like I was saying earlier, you have completely shifted the way that I understand how the world works. And it is not often that happens. So I really appreciate you taking the time.
Well, thank you. And you've done your homework, and, would love to run it back another time and get deeper into some of the technicals of some of these topics.
Oh man, I would love that. Speaking of things that I would love, boys and girls, if you have not already, be sure to subscribe. And until next time, my friends, be legendary. Take care. Peace. If you like this conversation, check out this episode to learn more.
By definition, the American government's job is to protect the government of the United States, not the people of the United States. Government employees, by and large, are not your sharpest, smartest, most motivated, most dedicated employee.
Help. What